Duane Allman didn't talk much about his own playing. He didn't have to. By 1969, anyone who'd heard him knew the way he moved a slide up a neck, slow, deliberate, like he was pulling sound out of the wood itself. There was nobody else doing it like that. Studio musicians twice his age would watch his hands and go quiet. He was 22. He'd grown up in the South, soaked in blues the way other kids soaked in cartoons. Not the kind that came from people who played because there was nothing else to do with what they felt. He'd learned slide from records, from watching older men in dim rooms, from hours alone with a guitar he probably should have outgrown by then. By the time he was a teenager, the slide wasn't a technique anymore. It was just how he spoke. There's a difference between someone who plays slide and someone who thinks in slide. Duane was the second kind. When he heard a melody in his head, he heard it already bent, already sliding from one note toward the next without quite landing, hovering in that in-between space where the emotion actually lives. It was the only way he knew how to be honest on the instrument. So when someone mentioned Jimi Hendrix in the same breath as him, Duane would nod, respectfully, sincerely. Jimi was extraordinary. Everyone knew that, but extraordinary in a different direction. Jimi was electricity and fire and something almost violent in the best possible way. Duane was depth, roots, the sound of something old and true. That's what he told himself. For a while it was enough. The night it changed wasn't planned. That's almost always how the real moments work. A friend had mentioned a show, small venue, nothing official. Jimi was going to play a short set, the kind of thing that happened quietly in 1969, before it became a story people told for years. Duane shrugged. He had his own things to work on. The Allman Brothers Band was starting to take shape, and he was living inside that sound, building it note by note, figuring out what they were and what they weren't yet. But the friend was persistent, and the night was slow, and Duane had nothing that couldn't wait until tomorrow. So he went. The club held maybe 200 people if nobody breathed too deeply. It was the kind of place where the floor was sticky, and the lighting was bad, and the sound system had seen better decades. You could smell the age of it, the years of cigarette smoke soaked into the walls, the particular dampness of a room that had absorbed 10,000 nights of music and sweat and spilled beer. Duane came in late, stood near the back, didn't bother pushing forward. He wasn't there to watch. Not really. He ordered a drink, leaned against the wall, and talked to someone about something he wouldn't remember later. The stage was empty. A single amp hummed in the low light. Then Jimi came out. No announcement, no introduction. He just walked out, picked up his Stratocaster, and stood there for a moment like he was getting used to the air in the room. He didn't look at the audience. He pulled one string with his thumb, held it, tilted his head slightly to one side, listening to something. Just listening. Duane watched from the back. He didn't stop his conversation immediately. A few more words, half a sentence. Then he stopped. Something had changed in the room. He couldn't have said what, but it had. Jimi started playing. There was no slide on his finger that night, no bottleneck, no tool of any kind, just his hand, his fingers, the strings, and an amp set to something that shouldn't have worked but did. And what came out wasn't what Duane had expected. It wasn't loud in the way Jimi was known for being loud. It was something slower, something that moved like water instead of fire. The notes didn't cut. They pulled. They bent up to a pitch and hung there, just a half second longer than they should have before letting go. Duane knew what that sound was. It was a slide sound, without the slide. He set his drink down on the nearest surface. He didn't notice doing it. His eyes were fixed on Jimi's left hand, watching the way his fingers pressed and released, the way he was coaxing sustain from pressure alone, from pure intention, from something that didn't have a name in any technique book Duane had ever read. Nobody had told Duane this was possible. He'd never thought to ask. He moved forward. Not a lot, just a step or two, then a little more. By the time he was fully aware of where he was standing, he was 10 feet from the stage. His drink was somewhere behind him. He didn't go back for it. There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when something true is happening on a stage. Not quiet, Jimi was loud enough, but underneath the sound, underneath the distortion and the sustain, and the feedback threading through it all like a second voice underneath the first, there was something completely still. People stopped talking, not because someone asked them to, because they forgot they'd been talking. Duane stood there and watched a man play guitar in a way that had no real name. Jimi wasn't showing off. That was the thing that kept getting him. There was nothing performative about what was happening. Jimmy's eyes were somewhere else entirely. He was inside the music, not presenting it. The sounds coming out of that amp weren't aimed at the audience. They were just the sounds that needed to come out. Duane had spent years learning how to play like he meant it. He was good at it, better than almost anyone in any room he'd ever walked into. But watching Jimi, he felt the first real doubt he'd had in a long time. Not about technique, not about his slide work or his tone or his timing, about whether he'd ever truly stopped thinking while he played, about whether the thing he called instinct was actually just a very fast version of calculation, about the distance, maybe enormous, maybe uncrossable, between knowing how to do something and simply doing it. He didn't have an answer. He just stood there and watched. The set wasn't long, maybe 40 minutes. When it ended, Jimi set the guitar down carefully, nodded once at no one in particular, and walked off. No encore, no bow, no big finish. Just done. The room came back to itself slowly. People exhaled. Someone started clapping, and the rest followed. The way you clap after something that made you forget where you were and who you came with. Duane didn't clap. He stood there staring at the empty stage. The amp was still humming. A friend found him a few minutes later and said something about getting another drink, going somewhere else, continuing the night the way nights were supposed to continue. Duane said, "Yeah, sure." He followed for a while, but he wasn't really there anymore. He drove home alone that night. He went inside. His guitar was in the corner the way it always was, case open, latches undone, always ready. He walked past it. He didn't pick it up that night. The next morning it was still in the corner. His bandmate Greg called in the afternoon. They had things to work through, ideas to run down, the usual business of building something together. Duane said he'd come by. He didn't. That evening he sat in the same room as his guitar and still didn't play. He just sat with it there. The way you sit in a room with someone you need to think about before you speak to them. The guitar didn't say anything. It just waited, the way it always did. The day after that, someone who knew him well enough knocked on the door and came in, saw him sitting there, asked what was wrong. Duane looked up. "Nothing's wrong," he said. Then after a moment that lasted a little too long, "I thought I knew how to play guitar." He said it simply without any drama, the way you'd say something plain and obvious about the weather. The other person didn't know what to say back to that, so they didn't say anything. Duane looked back at the wall. 3 days, he said quietly. "Give me 3 days." On the third day he picked it up. He didn't go back to where he'd been. He didn't run through the progressions his fingers knew by instinct, the patterns he could play in his sleep, the things that had made people in studio hallways stop and stare. He sat on the edge of his bed and started slow. Lower on the neck than usual, less pressure, more space between the notes than he'd ever allowed himself before. He was asking different questions now. Not how do I play this, but why? Why does this note need to be here? What happens if I wait a little longer? What happens if I don't reach for the thing I always reach for? The move that works, the one that sounds good, the one that proves I know what I'm doing. And instead, I just wait for the thing that's actually true. It was harder. It took longer. Nothing came out clean at first, but something came out honest. The Allman Brothers Band recorded their first album later that year. Anyone who listens closely can hear something in Duane's playing that sits differently from what came before. The slide is still there. It was always the slide. But it breathes more now. It takes its time. It leaves more room around each note, more air, more silence that isn't empty, but full of something about to happen. Nobody talked about it directly. These things never announce themselves. They just show up in the work, and you either hear it or you don't. Duane Allman died in October 1971. He was 24 years old, a motorcycle accident on a road in Macon, Georgia, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. He left behind less than 3 years of recorded work with the Allman Brothers. People have spent decades going back to those recordings, trying to understand how someone could play like that, where it came from, how it got inside the music so deep that you can feel it in your chest before your brain knows what it's hearing. Part of the answer lives in a night in 1969. A small club, a sticky floor, bad lighting, a man playing guitar with no slide on his finger, making sounds that had no right to exist. Before he died, Duane gave a handful of interviews. He talked about Jimmy in nearly all of them, not to explain it, not to build it into something bigger than it was, just because it was true, and he wasn't the kind of person who left true things unsaid. "I didn't touch my guitar for 3 days after I saw him play," he said once. "Not because I was depressed about it, because I needed to sit with what I'd heard. I needed to understand what I'd been missing before I could go back and pick it up again." He paused for a second, the way he did when something mattered. "Jimmy didn't teach me slide. He taught me why slide exists." That's really the whole story. There's no dramatic conversation between them. No scene where Jimmy says something wise and Duane takes notes. They were in the same room. Jimmy played, Duane listened. That was enough. Some things don't need to be explained out loud. They just arrive quietly. In a small club, bad lighting, a single amp humming on a stage, and they change the way you hold the thing you love most. Duane Allman walked into that room thinking he understood the guitar. He walked out knowing he was only just getting started.